Welcome back, everybody, to the Flatirons Podcast. This is episode number 111, I believe. We've got Tasso in the shop, DP's in the shop. Tasso, you were in here the other day, and one of the things we talked about, and I think it's worth at least starting off this conversation or this episode with it, is to talk about synthetic fuel. And the inspiration for me to ask you about it back then was when we had the episode where we're talking about how Subaru's now announced that it's moving to an electric platform much more aggressively, and just, kind of what that looked like, what that meant. There's a lot of people that, some people were excited about that, some people were curious, some people were not so enamored with it. Kind of looking around the internets, as it were, at that same time, there's more and more conversation starting to percolate up about synthetic fuel. And I figured there's not a ton of conversation about it yet, but it would be worth a discussion maybe is a counterpoint.
Sure.
And what we're talking about here with synthetic fuel, it literally amounts to is taking, basically recapturing carbon from the atmosphere, from the air, using electrolysis to capture hydrogen from water, and then combining the hydrogen and the carbon together to make your own hydrocarbon string, and literally making gasoline from air, as it were.
I think that part's important to clarify here.
Yeah.
Because even before I looked into it for this podcast, essentially, I wasn't clear even, because I had heard synthetic fuel before, but there's a lot of synthetic fuels.
Right.
So specifically, the buzz right now is synthetic gasoline.
Yeah.
Right? A synthetic petroleum.
Right.
Which is new to me, right? I mean, I hadn't really heard about it or looked into it really until this. Because there are a lot of synthetic fuels, right?
Right.
And I'm going to make this point over and over. Ethanol is still the way of the future.
This is the way.
It's the Lord's fuel.
Well, yeah.
This is a new thing. It's exciting. And at first glance, I agree. It looked like the what the hell solution. What are we still worried about kind of thing, right?
Well, so the problem with it, and I guess the first thing that I would say as far as the validity of this is what Porsche is working on and Formula One is working on moving to. So Formula One says that they want to be carbon neutral starting in 2026, and the whole way that you can be carbon neutral, and there's layers to this, there's complexities to this certainly, but the way that they're doing this is through synthetic fuel. So the cars are still going to run on internal combustion engines and the hybrid power plants, but the fuel that's going into the tanks of the cars is going to be this fuel that's basically pulled from the carbon from the atmosphere, put into the cars, so that it's a net zero carbon.
Yeah,
release.
as long as you find the power source in order to synthesize this fuel
Through
in a green
renewable
fashion.
Yeah.
Then, in theory, the burning of this fuel just re-releases the same carbon that you captured to make the fuel.
Yeah.
So is it balanced? Sure.
Right.
I don't think that's probably Formula One's biggest hurdle to tackle.
There's a lot. Formula One, there's a company that Patty Lowe, who was the technical director for Mercedes for a long time, he's the one that basically put everything together to make it possible for them to make this. And then Porsche has been doing a lot of research to make synthetic fuel in, I think, the same or similar fashion. And I think Porsche's direction or motivation for doing it is in part to make their racing, give the racing their chance to be a little bit more carbon neutral, but also they're thinking forward to the point in Europe where internal combustion engines are going to be banned or limited, significantly limited. And so I think in long term they're thinking, or they're looking for a way to let their customer base, their enthusiast base, still have a way to use their cars when carbon or internal combustion engines aren't allowed.
Yeah, at some point it won't just be new old stock parts; it'll also be new old stock fuel, to maintain your car. Right.
So there, and all of that is to say that as crazy as this might sound, there's some really big powers that be that are working in this direction, and then if you can get past it, once you accept that okay, this is possible. It is something that can be done.
It exists right now.
It exists.
Right.
It's right now. So it exists. It's just really expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking something like $100 a liter,
Oh,
or maybe it's $30 a liter. I thought it was $100 a gallon.
The information I saw said about $10 a liter.
Okay.
Which is $38 a gallon or something like that.
Okay. But it's $30 a gallon. Let's even say that. I mean, so it's possible, it's doable right now, but that's pretty expensive.
Yes.
Yeah, that's outrageous. I mean, is that going to just end up driving, if that does have that trickle-down effect that we would all hope it would, to eventually maybe being something that's accessible for, not just the top-tier racers, but something that you could get to put into your regular ICE engine.
Right.
At like our level.
Right. Well, that's where that's what my motivation was to have a conversation about it, because Formula One is basically motorsports where money almost is unlimited, even though they have budgets. I mean, come on.
Budgets.
But like it's not attainable for most people. But just the fact that it exists, once you know that it's possible, like knowing that it's possible, it becomes, if you just think about how it could be applied or how it could be used, if you can make it more affordable, then that's where something like that becomes interesting, and maybe it becomes more worth having a discussion or thinking about than it might seem at the outset. Again, just because of how borderline crazy it sounds as far as what it would take to make.
I'm intrigued and curious about, right now with our catalysts that are required in cars, with a system like that where you're recuperating these hydrocarbons that we're effectively burning off in platinum, palladium, and rhodium. Is that going to make that obsolete, or is there going to be some new catalyst requirement that's going to be coming down the road if we are to, in the future, recapture our hydrocarbons that we are blowing up?
Well, more than anything, I think, just if they're figuring out the science and they're figuring out the process, then there's a lot of probably bespoke technology that goes into making it work right now, which is why it's so expensive. But it's just there's not really a lot of investment in the technology, and so that's where all these small companies are having to foot the bill themselves. So that's where the cost is really, really high, and probably the ability to actually make it more available to the mass market becomes next to zero. And to a certain extent, I guess back to your point, Tasso, this is kind of in some ways the ethanol problem. So ethanol, yes, it is the Lord's fuel. It is the best solution probably out there for a lot of applications. The problem is, how do you make it? They were making it in an efficient way that wasn't as dependent on a plant, a crop to harvest and then convert into ethanol. Ultimately, they were trying to find that, but they were never really able to find that on scale, and so that's where ethanol kind of hit its stumbling blocks. Mm-hmm. So, but there was a point where there was a lot of research dollars being spent on it, but they just never quite got it to where it was viable on scale, and then basically they moved in different directions.
And energy density too, I think.
Right.
People, why would I put this other fuel in my car if it makes the mileage go down? It was the pushback from any GM vehicle, flex fuel, vehicle owner.
Yeah.
Right. All of these topics come with so many moving parts that it's almost impossible to talk about any one of them, because all of these things exist in the same spider web, and they're all pulling on each other, right? Whether it's ethanol, synthetic fuels, capitalism, the corporate government America and stuff like that.
And politics plays a part in it too, which is right. Tricky.
Does a synthetic petroleum solve any problems that electric cars have?
It does not.
Not really, right? The biggest one is ability to store energy, right?
Well, and the fact that the vehicles that could use it are already there, and right. the infrastructure is already in place to get the fuel where it needs to be and to distribute the fuel.
Yeah, you could ship synthetic fuels by fossil fuel networks.
Or because in theory, if they could figure out a way to do it, because all you need access to is basically the atmosphere and water, you can actually have a lot of, I don't know what you would even call these things, distilleries?
Sure.
Or something like that.
Carbon capture plants or something.
Carbon capture plants
but,
that would be creating it
just the fact that you said it kind of keyed my brain in on it here. Access to water too, right?
Yeah.
You have things like Southern California, which have leached the world around it dry just to exist.
Right.
So maybe, I mean, people talk about the water wars are coming.
Yeah.
Right? So
All
is
this-
it an answer to
interesting.
that?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's I don't want to sound either like I'm dooming a new fuel, which I think is pretty exciting.
Well, and,
You know,
and-
or
yeah.
just a general doomsayer about the environment, because like those two things, again, like the rest of this, can't be summed up that simply. The whole thing has to exist on a dynamic scale.
well, my thought is it's not one of the difficult situation that we're putting ourselves in is trying to find one solution and one solution only. It's the fact that there in terms of just transportation, there's one solution in place now for the majority of us, which is cars and an internal combustion engine, and but there are some downsides to it, which they're trying to curb by moving us to electric cars, and so there's a whole discussion out there about that, but the problem is getting basically the majority of the globe to make this big paradigm shift in the way that they're thinking about and using transportation and moving from one very well established method into a new method that requires that one has nothing to do with the other basically. So if you can look at something instead of the one solution, look at it as a possible multi-path or multiple paths to the same solution, which is, well, what if we put some of those research dollars that have been spent on batteries into this synthetic fuel? Can we do it more efficiently? Can we get it down to $5 a liter? Can we get it down
Sure.
to $2 a liter? So that, if you have an internal combustion engine and you still want to drive it, need to drive it, what have you, there's a more carbon neutral way to do it. Or, ethanol is still around. Ethanol might be still viable for people too. So if you have internal combustion engines and you have 2, maybe even 3 choices of fueling methods, traditional gasoline, synthetic gasoline, and then ethanol, then that makes it at least more viable, and then that puts less stress on this move to electric, which is by all accounts to try and in a handful of years make the majority of the globe switch to that new platform. It puts a lot of stress and strain on manufacturing and the raw materials just to even make that physically possible.
Sure. It took 140 years to get to where we are right now with our fossil fuel distribution network, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think we're actually moving pretty fast with the electric vehicle one, probably by comparison.
And
Right?
some might say too fast.
Well, sure.
I mean, well, that's the difficulty. I mean, it's I don't know, just the raw materials to make the batteries and stuff. I mean, that's a real sticking point, a stretching point, and
Yeah.
it just all has to get made. I mean,
That's
it doesn't
just it.
exist.
Especially with your raw materials that you're mining for the batteries, what is pulling those out is diesel
Right.
construction equipment of massive scale,
Right.
which is running in gallons per minute.
A lot of it's
Yeah.
diesel electric.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like you're
So-
kind of already doing the thing. I've seen many hybrid loaders and things, and large mining equipment that are in that hybrid platform that are still people will drill that down to, oh well, you're mining your electric battery with my diesel fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I think that's been pretty summarily debunked at this point, right? It's even if you're using fossil fuels to create electricity, the electric car is still more efficient per fossil fuel unit than an internal combustion one is. And I think anyone that kind of, at this point, the largely political arguments against electric fuels, and that's fine. You can have your opinions about one way or the other. No one's going to tell you you can't. But take synthetic fuels, you're going through those same processes and then just adding another process on top because you want your car to run on the thing it did before. Right?
Well, and it's the effective energy density goes away, or gets
in going to
complicated.
electric?
In the
battery
synthetic
storage?
fuel.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Yeah.
it's because how much energy. It takes a lot of energy to put in to get this liquid out. That now, yes, this liquid has a very high energy density,
Right.
but you put tons of energy in, and how efficient is that process? Even if it's
Less efficient.
it's
Yeah.
less efficient, like
Yeah.
40-50%.
Yeah, and that's why it's so expensive at this point, right?
Right.
And people also have opinions politically about why gas is so expensive, but
Right.
gas is largely a supply and demand thing, right? And
Yeah.
then there's processing on top of that, refining, and then there's a little sliver of taxes that everyone's got to get theirs off the top, right? It costs a lot to make synthetic fuels. It costs a lot to make fossil fuels into fuels too, right?
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
we're used to that cost at this point
Well,
because
and it has, you have to have this massive infrastructure, but the infrastructure already exists.
yeah, so we're not paying off the loans on
Right.
a brand new way to ship fossil fuels around
Right.
now. Like the pipes are there,
Right.
So
Right. Well, and see, my thought is, where part of, I think the biggest part of this that's really creating people to have to form a really, for lack of a better term, like a severe or a really entrenched opinion about it, is you have to make a choice. Am I going to stick with the old school, or am I going to move to the new school? And then, like, whichever end of that decision you land on, then your people are, generally speaking, like, once they have their think about it and then they land on either side of that fence, then they're pretty well entrenched on that side of the fence.
Mm-hmm.
But it's because we're forcing people to make a really pretty dramatic choice.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, if we could look at something like, figuring out ethanol again, or if the synthetic fuel long term has a better chance of being something that could be more efficiently produced than even ethanol, like if you really put in the R&D dollars to it, so that you could really make this, and it'd still be internal combustion, but it's carbon neutral instead of something that's being refined from crude oil. It makes it so that you don't have to land really hard on either side of that fence. You can kind of, I don't know, you can sit on the fence more, I guess.
It
is
could be
what
like a hybrid on it, where you're on one
Yeah.
side and the other. As it
Yeah.
were.
Yeah, it's like, hey, I'll still drive my car, but if I had to pay a little bit more for the fuel in the car to be a carbon neutral, I'll do that, because it's the same car, but now the carbon that's coming out of the tailpipe was captured from the atmosphere to make the fuel to go into the engine to come out of the tailpipe again. Something like it, basically giving people another path to it.
Or just rip the Band-Aid off and go get an electric car.
Well, and that's where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend like I have this solution or that I like the electrification of the world or whatever,
Yeah.
but I think that the main arguments for synthetic fuels are hanging on to our hobby.
Well, but I mean, the other part of it, and kind of like what we talked about, one of the recent episodes, is just how expensive cars have gotten.
Yeah,
I mean,
everything.
So it's like, if I could go out right now and buy an electric car that would be fun to drive, and it would cost about what a car cost, the average purchase price of a car, like, say, even 3 or 4 years ago, I think I would be more willing to do it, and a lot of people would be more willing to do it if you were looking at something in like the $25,000 to $35,000 price point versus like 50 to 60 as the starting point.
Yeah.
And they're starting to come down a bit, but
Yeah. I mean, the tricky thing is so many of these prices, too, not just for electric vehicles, which were heavily subsidized depending on where you work, or not where you work, where you live.
right. Yeah.
Colorado for a long time had really, really deep incentives for, like, those people are getting into Nissan Leafs for a few $1,000s,
Right.
which is just wild. But also look at the other side of that same coin, the fact that ethanol has gotten so much more expensive in the last 2 or 3 years
Because all the
because
subsidies
subsidies
are
have stopped going to corn farmers.
Yep.
So, ethanol is now almost the same price as our price gouged gasoline, because they realized that they could just not make as much and make more money on it. There's so much political action behind the scenes that lend kind of a false impression, depending on who the lobbyists are lobbying for, of what the future ought to be and stuff, right? My point about synthetic fuels being just a way to preserve our hobby is not so much a duh statement, but that's probably not a large enough driver for that money to go into that technology.
Yeah.
Right? If you phrase it as, this will save you money because you won't have to refit your entire fleet of cargo ships and trucks, and you can just run the same fuel in it, then maybe you have an argument that would drive enough dollars into this to even find out if we could make it for the same price, because that has billions to trillions of dollars of effect versus our plucky little car industry here.
Right, that's a good point.
Of automotive enthusiasts, right? We don't have the power.
Right, shipping and
change
transport. I mean, that might
politics.
actually be.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that comes back around then to Formula One's whole thing.
Well, and that's actually where they're having the difficulty, because, like, if you're going to use, like, trucks to transport goods, and they're trying to come up with these electric semi-trucks.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're having this big load that the truck is having to carry, and that's what we're now discovering, that electric motors have tons of torque and they can pull it very easily, but the energy consumption goes up to the point where now the range becomes an issue.
And I don't know what Formula One's actual behind-the-scenes work on this is. I'm assuming it's largely a political statement that they're making. We're going to use synthetic fuels in the race cars and then go fill up with Jet A for the DHL planes that fly our entire circus to the next country every week, kind of thing, right?
Well, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's their struggle to stay relevant.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, you have Formula E, which is the all-electric Formula series.
It's boring.
Yeah, I mean, it's... Well, they finally got to the point. I think the Gen 3 cars are going to be better than the Gen 2s.
Sure, it's fine. It's better than watching golf or
well,
something.
but like for range, the Gen 1, they had to have, each
Car
driver had to have
switches.
2 cars.
Yeah.
You had to hop into a whole other car because they
swaps.
couldn't.
Oh, man.
Yeah, because they couldn't have a battery that would make it even half the length of the race. And so now, they're figuring out the car is getting faster. All those sorts of things. It's getting better, but it's not. Formula E is not Formula 1.
I thought I came in here with an opinion on this today. And this is the same way with most of these podcasts when it's about something that's not race car related. I come in here and change my mind several times over the course of the podcast.
This one in particular, it's something that I was initially not that in favor of, but then researching it more, hearing more about what it was, it's like what it is now doesn't make a lot of sense. And even to a certain extent, what Formula One is trying to do with it, borderline almost doesn't make a lot of sense. But now that the technology is there, it's like thinking ahead, like a handful of years or so many years of development. It's like, well, it might be really inefficient now, but if they could find a way to make it more efficient, all of a sudden, maybe this takes a lot of the stress out of trying to make this big paradigm shift quickly away, which makes it so that, again, it's not so stressful. There's not such a big change that is required from so many of us so quickly, so that we can wait for better battery technology to come out. Wait for battery technology to come out where it doesn't require so many rare earth minerals, which is, I mean, they've kind of figured those batteries out, but they haven't been able to mass produce them.
It's a matter of time, though. I mean, that solution's coming. But, so they're means of conveyance to most people. And if you ask a person, what's your opinion on alternative fuels, hybrids, electric vehicles, normal gasoline, they would say, well, I guess gas is bad, right? But it seems like there's not that much electric vehicle charging. I hear that's really bad. And that's all they would know or care.
Sure.
So
sure.
They don't care. That's what
Well, okay, so
what are we trying to solve here still with
Right.
synthetic fuels, other than I want to hear motor go boom?
Well, to me, again, it's just, one, let us bide a little bit more time so that we can come up with a better electric solution. It will, because of all the money that's been invested, right now, today, 2023 versus probably 2026, 2027, the advantages that an electric car are going to have in that short 3 to 4 year time window are going to be, I think, pretty significant once we get into this next generation of batteries. That's where all of a sudden, charging is going to be faster, the range is going to be better, and the cost should be much more in line with what me in my brain thinks of as a cost range for a reasonable price range for a car, which is $25,000 to $35,000, which right now almost doesn't exist.
Don't get a Forester. You can't barely get a Forester for that, right?
Right.
Barely.
Even those, yeah. But the thing that comes to my mind when you say that, Tasso, is let's go back to relevance, right? Because if the majority of people that are buying and using cars, fun is really not on their mind or whatnot, and racing, though it is kind of having a comeback, ironically spurned by Formula One due to
Netflix.
Drive to Survive on Netflix.
Yeah, right.
People are now realizing how much drama there really is around racing, even if the racing, the passing isn't that exciting. It's but at the end of the season, when Drive to Survive comes out, now you can hear about all the stuff that's going on in the background. That's what's now focused people's attention. Is it relevant, and does it have to be relevant how important is just racing in general to be relevant for car manufacturers to make the cars, or for us as enthusiasts to be able to go out there and build the cars? I guess the short answer is, if we like to do it, maybe probably it doesn't have to be relevant.
Yeah, I mean, like, my car, 2004 Forester, like, it's like, well, why don't you buy a new one? Well, because I like this one.
Yeah.
I put my money, sweat, tears, and other people's sweat, tears, and blood into it
Yeah.
to make it where I do enjoy driving it. So it's like, maybe that's just enough to keep it to me.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I don't want a new one because this one is mine.
Right.
And that's kind of like our whole, as far as our cadre of friends and associates are all people in that same boat. Like, this one is mine. There are many like it, but I made this one the way I wanted it.
Right.
So I want to keep it that way. I don't want to buy into a.
Yeah. There's
newer
years
thing.
of refinement to get it to the point where, like, this is now it's done. It's perfect, which is a lie. It's never done.
Yeah,
Or perfect.
Years of refinement, so
But-
I can sit in my garage and I can drive my 11 Prius to work every day. But
Right. There was a minute there, and it lasted longer than I guess I would have expected in the moment, where ethanol was the solution. The problem is that you're depending on a plant to grow in a crop that could be harvested to make it, and like they finally got to this point where they were trying. Like the whole switchgrass thing, like to find a crop that could be used to create it, but that didn't take as long and that could be harvested more than, basically once a year or once per growing season or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then there's that algae that they figured out they could get it to produce ethanol, but they just couldn't do it in scale. They couldn't do it in a way to make it so that you could produce lots and lots of it. So you've got the race car that you're building, which is on an older chassis. The track car, daily driver, whatever you want to call it, that's another older chassis.
Yeah.
Do you see any point down the road where, if you need another track car, if you need another race car, that you're not going to look at something that that you already been through and know all of the tricks and the stuff to build, and would instead look to something that you've not done before?
I would, and I have.
Okay.
Is the short answer.
Okay.
I balance two things constantly. I enjoy this, and it's not my job.
Right.
So I want to do what I enjoy. But what I enjoy as much as anything else is winning, and not just participating. So.
So where it would have a production or a competition advantage.
Right.
Oh, so this is back to where you
This
said,
is a
like,
statement.
for the hill climb, like all of a sudden you started realizing that for a hill climb environment there would be an advantage to an electric car potentially.
Yep. I don't want to commit to anything I ever say, so
Okay.
take all this with a grain of salt, internet.
Okay.
If there was a cost-effective drop-in electrification option for the hill climb car, I think about it.
Oh. So like if you could
There's
drop
more
in a
that
Tesla.
goes into it, though.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because and the GD chassis, like I said, is the last Subaru sports car.
Mm-hmm.
Everything since then has been a global platform compromise.
Okay.
I'm allowed to piss people off with my own opinion.
That's fine.
And my opinion is mine.
Yeah.
And there's not been a sports Subaru since 2007.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a lot that goes into the chassis other than just the powertrain. And that's a lot of what went into ultimately deciding on a GD. Other than I found one for $300.
Dang.
But that was a part of
McPherson
it,
struts all around.
Yeah.
Or whatever, I know that
Yeah.
one's not technically, but not multi-link,
Yep.
like the later cars. The size of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, the inherent chassis stiffness, all that stuff went into that decision as well.
Sure.
If there was a modern ESTIE thing
Right.
that had good gravel suspension, good chassis, it was light, it was cheap, yeah, totally, I would consider that car.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, again, hill climbing being my kind of chosen motorsport here, for a number of reasons, which go back about 100 podcasts, and you'll hear about why. Electric doesn't make sense, I don't think, for something like stage rally yet. So if I'd stuck with stage rally, I probably couldn't have stuck with ethanol either.
Right. Because even just like the mileage, the transits, and you have fueling.
Correct, yeah. For the same
services,
reasons,
yeah.
right? So for the same reasons, electricity wouldn't work for that. Ethanol also didn't really work for that.
Yeah.
Because of the volume of fuel you have to carry in order to make a full stage loop at speed and try and keep
and
the car
transit,
cool,
yeah.
so you're not like running super lean and stuff like that
Yeah.
to try and make mileage. Because I make a mile to the gallon right now, and I'm getting a slightly worse mileage than a stage rally car would because I make another 1 or 200
Yeah.
horsepower more than them, right? So you would have the same limitations. So to that end, synthetic fuels all day. So
and what if they could figure out synthetic fuels so that maybe it wasn't the same price as pump gas, but it's the same price as race gas?
Sure.
Because
yeah.
man,
But
and I'll tell you what, race gas has gone up. It
the
is
price and knock resistance aren't the only factors in choosing race gas. It's also the smell.
Yes.
Race
Okay.
gas smells
man.
great,
True.
and the race gas exhaust smells great.
100%.
So they need to make the synthetic fuel smell like race gas too.
And for those of you listening or watching at home, there are actual race gas candles out there.
Oh yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah, that's a thing.
I run E98 right now in the race car, or the last car did up till its death, and the new car will as well. It smells, when COVID happened, remember?
Back in the day, yeah.
Everybody that used to do other stuff started just cranking out hand sanitizer in their factories.
Right.
And there was that cheap, horrible alcohol smell and a lot of the COVID surge hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
That's what E98 smells like.
And so that has a place in your heart?
I guess it does, right? I mean, shit, has anyone smelled synthetic gas? I wonder what...
I have no idea.
This is maybe a factor. This may be the tiebreaker factor.
I mean, if they're making the
brain
rest of
here.
it, can't they put a scent into it? They'd have to.
Right, it's not the gasoline in race gas that smells that way. It's the additives, right?
Right.
So,
yeah. They have to be able to do that. Well, what I was going to say, though, I mean, if they get it to the point where, 10 years down the road, you can still run stage rally with, these vintage stage rally cars because synthetic fuel is available, well, then, I mean, if that keeps these vintage motorsports going, I mean, there's a value there, too.
Yeah. So for conversation, what is an analog for that right now?
An analog to...
Like leaded gases for early race cars?
I was just going to say, leaded gas or leaded
gas and
additives.
stuff. So a lot of guys,
Yeah.
you're not supposed to do this. So no one actually does this.
Don't do
But
this.
there are people that go and get avgas
Right.
from the airport to run in their internal combustion engines that aren't airplanes.
Right.
Because of knock resistance and price, too. It's a lot cheaper than race gas.
Right.
I don't know anyone currently is doing that. But actually, I don't know anyone currently is doing it.
Okay.
But I knew some people at one point that did.
Well, and it almost brings back to that question of relevance. Like, if you had to do something that extreme to still do the motorsport, and to a certain extent, I mean, how many people are out there racing a car that actually has to run leaded gasoline?
Very few, right?
In any kind of, like,
they're
real
doing
competition.
parade laps at Goodwood, right? Like
a lot of it is just vintage cars that they were built and they were designed.
I can think of a couple
to run.
people that do run them, like supercharged flathead V8s and things like that.
Right.
But it's just it's not for
it's
competition.
this much of the market,
But then
it's super cool.
Next generation of that is stuff like toluene and
Yep.
stuff, right? Where it's another gnarly ass chemical that's obviously
Don't
not
do
good
that
for
either.
the environment.
Don't do that either. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives you cancer immediately, I guess.
Like
Right.
you walk by it.
But again, that's why those Formula One cars from the '80s looked and ran so awesome, was because they had
Right. These
literal
crazy
cancer
additives.
stopping knock from happening.
But then does that answer the question of relevance? Why it's important to have the race cars be just tangential to what we are all driving and using? Because that's what keeps the interest and that's what keeps the development going into the sport. And if it is not relevant anymore, then that's where it would kind of go way into the shadows.
What needs to happen is Netflix needs to make Drive to Survive for Formula E. And if it's just as well received...
No.
Nope.
Netflix needs to make Drive to Survive for grassroots motorsports.
Well, yeah, that's what I want. But for this experiment, they need to make Drive to Survive for Formula E. And if it's just as well received, then we don't need synthetic fuels because we're irrelevant dinosaurs. And people just want to see drama.
Okay.
And they don't care what powers the cars.
I think it's the story behind it. And to me, like Netflix, because I'm sure that they're listening and watching, right? Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Netflix, this is for you. Like, there's so much more story and struggle and drama for grassroots motorsports compared to Formula One. I mean, yes, there's drama there too, but like guys that are doing this because they love to do it and they're doing it in their spare time versus guys that are getting paid like very large paychecks to do this. There's a whole different set of drama there and story there. And the other cool thing, Netflix, for you listening, for the grassroots side of it is that's an interesting and compelling story that is much more attainable. You know, like when you're watching Formula One drivers, you're watching, you know, arguably probably 10 to 15 of the best drivers on the planet compete.
Yeah.
Yes, I know that there's 20, but 10 to 15 of the best drivers out there. And then, like, but that's it. Like, how many of us are those 10 to 15 people? Almost none. But, like, for grassroots guys, I mean, there's a lot of grassroots guys that you don't have to be the best driver if you can figure out the solution, if you can run enough seasons to know what you have to do to keep your car reliable, you know, figure out what is actually really the most important part or aspect of performance of this car in this racing series, so that you can actually, you know, get an edge and win. Like, that's all so much more attainable than what Formula One is to most of us.
I forgot. The person we should be trying to get in bed is Bezos.
Okay.
Our Lord and Savior.
Uh-huh.
Because he is going to run this show, so whatever he puts his money in is going to be... So what we need to do is convince...
Netflix yet.
Well, I'm sure he does. We just don't know.
Yeah.
He just invented someone else to own another company.
Oh, boy.
He's Tesla's dad.
Oh, boy.
We're way off the deep end. I'm
This
sorry.
This has gone off the rails.
I just offended literally all of religion.
Yes.
I don't know. I got
That's
nothing.
okay.
But
Well, but I mean, it's like...
Amazon Prime, whichever one they back.
Okay.
This could be a real weird tangent.
Yeah.
In the movie Tropic Thunder.
Did not see that coming. Okay.
When
All right.
They're walking through a field at some point, and Sandusky, or whatever is his character's name, the guy from This Is the End, that movie, when that guy's walking along talking about how Blu-ray won over HD DVD, and it was all about which one porn backed. And that's why it won.
Okay.
Reference to that movie.
Okay.
Now, at this point, whichever one Amazon Prime,
So this is
which is the porn of capitalism.
But ironically, Amazon also has a huge distribution network, so it actually could come at it from like a trucking and distribution.
Yeah, exactly.
Logistics.
They're the same thing
So,
now.
so literally, Amazon is shipping logistics, plus they have the streaming service where they don't have a racing series.
So
I think
Amazon
we've cracked this.
Prime,
All right,
Prime Video.
Netflix, this is not for you.
Yeah.
Amazon and
Untag
Jeff Bezos,
Netflix.
forget it. Amazon, the way you're going to compete with Netflix and Drive to Survive is you're going to come out with your own series
For grassroots
grassroots motorsports.
Because the main thing we do, other than total races, is make cool motor noises.
Yes.
So we want synthetic
Yes.
fuels.
Yes.
And so, Amazon Prime, please, sir,
Yes.
sponsor me.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know, man. Still make
Yes.
hay for horses, which are the cars of yesteryear. So why can't we keep making gasoline for cars, which are the cars of today, yesteryear?
Wait a minute. If we could find a way to take hay and convert it into fuel
Or horses.
for horses. No.
Or horses.
Or horses.
Nope.
No,
Just
hey.
take the cart
Pissed off cowboys
before
and
the
horse
horse.
people now.
Oh,
Oh, man.
yeah. Well, but you know, to a certain extent, like what you saw with catalytic converters, where everything got crazy expensive with catalytic converters, and then so people started stealing the catalytic converters. Then you have a car that has one that gets stolen. Now what do? That's kind of like what I wonder is that the 5 to 10 year future that we have if you have an internal combustion, especially an internal combustion engine race car? Is it something where gradually, but at an accelerated rate over the next 5 to 10 years, is it going to be something where you're either going to have to spend exorbitant amounts of money to even go out and use this thing, which is going to make it so that next to nobody does?
Well, horses.
Or yeah, I mean, but it's
You're going to have little pockets of rich people that play with their toys.
right. But then what does that do for the enthusiast base now?
Limits it.
Limits it, changes it.
Mm-hmm. Arguably, it's already limited. It just limits it further, right? So
You got to figure that most people that take a car and turn it into a race car, most people don't do it with a brand new car. Most people are starting with a car that's like say 5 to 7 years old. There's a gap where there's just like the amount of cars even that are choices out there in the last 2 to 3 years is pretty small. If you wanted to build a race car or a track car, and it's only getting smaller. And there's that new legislation where they're going to do the crazy emission standards by 2032. That car manufacturers, 2032, that's basically 8 years away, and they probably need 4 to 5 years to ramp up to that. So like they're not. I mean, I would say that there's a possibility that like really like a platform that you could take right now and turn into a race car that would be exciting as an enthusiast. We might have 2 to 3 years left, and that might be it, unless somehow there's some hybrid something that they can get through in those next handful of years that would have some potential for a rally car, for
But
a
it still
track
brings up
car.
what a race car or what a fun car is to drive. And it's a thing that we've been saying for a long time. Emission standards restrict power, but not handling necessarily, right? Like it's.
Yeah.
I think
Right.
Abby's Crosstrek, for as slow as a first generation whatever Crosstrek is a great car to drive. I love driving it. It has decent vehicle dynamics,
It just doesn't have the get up and go.
and it's even fine. It's probably
Yeah.
faster than a Miata in
Right.
stock form,
Oh, no,
right?
the Miata guys are after you.
Yeah, sure, whatever.
Yeah.
They have to catch you.
I haven't pissed
Yeah.
off.
Faster.
I'm trying to find every little niche that I haven't pissed off yet and
Right.
catch them as well.
Well,
So-
but where are you going with this? The fact that like our perceptions have to shift. Our perceptions will shift to what is an
Most of the
enthusiast-based
most
car.
fun cars I've had to drive, ever driven, could have been. No, I'm gonna take that back. I was gonna say they could have been emissions legal. I'm gonna take that back. They don't need to be big fire-breathing monsters in order to be fun. There's fun in power,
Yeah.
but it is the tactile.
It's the whole package. It isn't
It's
like
the
as
driver
long as-
engagement to the car.
as long as if you're just driving the car by yourself, it doesn't matter to a certain extent how fast it is, because if you hit the go pedal and the car goes to the point where you're just like, wow, this is fun, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
That's all that matters in that moment. And so if you have the steering input, the chassis mechanics, the feel of the car, where it turns, it handles and stuff, in that moment, in that scenario, that's where you get attached to the car.
Yeah.
And I think to a large extent, a lot of us, like this is where the Subarus grab us, right? You have this car that you're just driving into work. It's not on a racetrack. You're not comparing it necessarily to any of the other cars around. But when you give it the beans, or you turn it into a corner, or it's snowing, and you're just like you're going and you're having the greatest old time, and you're watching all these Camrys and Corollas and things just like go into the ditch. You're like, this is the most amazing car ever. How could I ever drive anything else? That's where it grabs you. But then now, so much of that mentality for the majority of people that drive cars, I think, is switched to just the straight acceleration.
Yeah, look at Mopars.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right.
1,000 plus horsepower.
Well, drag racing.
straight
Drag
line.
racing is a
Whoa.
huge thing. There's a huge motorsports fan base for drag racing, but it's
Yeah.
just acceleration in a straight line.
Yeah.
That is the only part of that discipline. But
Yeah.
but it grabs people, and it's I think more people are grabbed by that than ever before.
So the thing though is that I think the largest threat to, or a larger than electrification threat to the automotive enthusiast is self-driving cars.
100%.
Yeah.
Because soon it will be, are you insane, you madman? How are you going to be able to take responsibility for killing that kid? Even
Well-
though you will likely not go kill a kid.
Well,
in
but
your
even
entire
if they
time.
can't figure out autonomous driving, the problem is the car manufacturers think that that's what everybody wants. So they've put all their development dollars into getting the car to drive itself. And if the car can drive itself and you're just sitting in it, now it doesn't matter what the driver experience is of driving the car. This is where there's so many of these electric cars that have like a Tesla, perfect example. The interior is designed to be like this comfortable and nice space to be in. It's not about the driver, because
Right.
their whole goal is to make the car drive itself. So now they're trying to optimize the space so that you're looking at that vehicle thinking even just about your commute of like, well, I have to commute 30 minutes each way to and from work every day. I want to use this car because in this space, I can read the paper, watch a movie, play video game, echo fart sounds around the car, whatever it is about being in that space. Then now that you're buying the car because of the space that you're in, it has nothing to do with the driving experience.
Yeah.
Well, I think soon we'll have to. I think, well, I don't know about that soon. At some point, the liability of driving your own vehicle will not be sustainable.
I don't think so. I think the liability of having the car drive itself is going to be unsustainable, and that's why it's all going to go away. But the problem is that they've put so many car manufacturers have put so much energy into that direction because they thought once Tesla started really aggressively moving into that space, and then everybody was talking about how cool that was, they decided, oh, that's actually what people want now. They don't want a car that is a great driving car. They don't want a car that weighs.
Well, most people do want that, though. I think. I think most people want to not have to go to work, but if they have to, they want to make it not their problem.
Well, no, they don't want to drive to work, and if they do have to drive to work, they want to be able to just sit and be a passenger instead of be actually engaged with driving.
But also not have to have like a taxi driver or something like that.
Right.
Because then they have to interact with somebody.
To a certain extent, I think that there's not enough people that really prioritize driving. Driving is a bit of a blind spot for people because it's so easy, relatively speaking, for most of us to do it, that like once you become capable of driving to and from work from point A to point B without having an issue, then that's it. And it's not something that most people continue to refine. To a certain extent, like for motorsports enthusiasts, that's the driving force there is like, I know that I can do this, but there's a whole nother level of doing this thing that I really want to try and figure out and try and get better at. I mean, if you want, the saying in motorsports is if you want to win, get a fin. And it's because in Finland, like the requirements for getting a driver's license and stuff like that are so much more strict and involved. There's so much more skill that you have to demonstrate that you have before you can get the driver's license because of, how much potential of risk there is on the roads. Like they realize, well, hey, we have to raise the standards. We can't just give driver's license out to everybody. And so then those people that put in that effort and that energy, they become better drivers. But there's, it's really hard at this point to convince somebody that this thing that you can do and have successfully done, you could do it better, and you could, if you put more energy into driving, you could become a better driver. But if we could get more people to put energy into driving, then maybe there'd be more of an enthusiast base. There'd be more of a motivation to use those skills and hone those skills.
Yeah.
And then we wouldn't have to worry about hiring lawyers to defend us for driving.
This
maybe.
is true. I want to circle back. Because that's what I like to do is kind of revisit something we already have beaten the horse till it's glue. But with the emission standards tightening and all that, improving the driving, like itself, the actual sensation of driving. I remember a while back I autocrossed a Lotus Elise, and that was like the best driving car I had driven. A 1.8 Toyota engine. Yeah. So I mean, nothing crazy, not any fire breathing, snorting monster, like 100 and some horsepower. But so mechanical. You were a part of that car and that driving experience from the time you were in it to the time I had to park it. It was like just a hoot, and it was only like just a couple of gears and low speed, but good night. It was like everything I wanted it to be. Yeah. I mean, then I hopped into my modified Forester and I was like, this thing goes really fast, a straight line, but it doesn't handle nearly as well as that Lotus did. And so maybe that's where we need to shift, like what we do. Yeah. Is with like the 22, hey, I can't do this because
instead of bolt-ons or bolt-offs.
Yeah, it's like 2-piece brakes and like sway bars and coilovers, and lighter wheels, chassis bracing, things of that nature. That you can still do some of these things to get the feel right. I mean, like it's going to feel even like the electric racks. They can still have some of that simulation of the road. Yeah. But if you change the dynamics of the car to feel like you're going fast, like you don't have to drive crazy or insane to have a great time. I mean, like I mentioned, my 90 horsepower Prius, and I drive 42 miles. I have a ball. I found like twisty roads, and it's fun to drive a slow car at the speed limit, through the corners, because I don't you don't slow down as much because I've somewhat honed my craft as driving.
There's a drive. It doesn't even matter if it's quick or not. It's the experience. Like you found a way to appreciate the experience. with the car that you have.
Yeah.
And that's where, like, the electric cars, I think there's so many of them that are pulling the driver experience away. Like, what's interesting to me is that Porsche is one of the only ones thus far that has really aggressively come out and said, like, they're prioritizing the experience behind the electric motivation. So, like, yes, it's an electric car, but it still feels like a Porsche. But they're one of the only manufacturers that really has prioritized that. But it's like, that's where it's that's what my biggest fear is, that it's going to end up being missing with all these electric cars, is that they're not designed with the driver in mind. They're big heavy cars anyway because of the batteries.
Yeah.
And they're just not designed to be fun cars to drive. And if they're not fun cars to drive, then there's not going to be an enthusiast base that is connected to it.
100%.
I would rather drive, though, an electric car with a nice quick rack with low boost, like manual brakes, not power brakes, a decent set of tires, nice suspension, than I would an internal combustion car with an automatic transmission and a heavily boosted rack with a nice slow ratio.
Right.
And whatever. Like, I don't think the electrification is the problem there.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
it's the design mentality that's going into the electric car platform. It's because none of these car manufacturers are building electric cars for the enthusiast, except for something like the Taycan.
But they're not making internal combustion cars for the enthusiasts either. Cars aren't for the enthusiasts for some time.
Well, it's
I
because
think,
we're in this like transitional phase where they realize, a lot of car manufacturers, not all, it sounds like now pretty much all of them have realized they've got to put all their eggs in the electric basket.
Mm-hmm.
A decent number of car manufacturers realized, well, we have to start thinking about hybrids or electrics maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And that's where, like, right now we're in this pocket where, like, these enthusiast chassis have just dried up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right now, if you could find one, I mean, you've got, like, BMW is still making the M cars. Toyota's got the Supra and the GR Corolla.
The M car.
Yeah. Subaru, the WRX, I think it still fits there. I think it has a place in the enthusiast base, the WRX. I think there's a potential for Subaru to make it even better, which we've talked about, but I think it still holds into that. I mean, Porsche is still making those cars. There's still the Corvette. I mean, really, like, the attainable sports car right now, I think if like a true sports car from that sense would probably be the GR Corolla at 35, if you could find one, which you probably can't. Or, I mean, BRZ.
Yeah.
BRZ at 32 is, I mean, that is a sports car, and it is attainable.
Yeah, fine.
But it's like, or the Miata, which is like, either you like it or you don't, but
BRZ.
they're still out there.
Yep.
Same shit.
But it's like, when you've only got 3 flavors to choose from, then that's what makes it difficult.
Yeah.
And then that's where you start looking at, okay, well, what was it like? What can I look at that's 5 to 10 years old that maybe scratches more of that itch, because there were more of those cars made back then than there are being currently. Yeah. And again, I really feel like we're in this black hole where a lot of the enthusiast cars, the manufacturers have just stopped production of. They're not probably putting any R&D dollars into the next generation of, like, do you think that there's going to be a next generation of the current Supra?
I don't know. Depends
Probably
on
not.
market research, right?
Right.
Probably be electric.
Well, right. It
Is
feels
the
like we're in
Mustang
this
Mach-E a Mustang?
Ford Escape of the Mustang knows.
almost certainly not.
Is the... I was thinking of Eclipse.
Oh, that poor thing. Look what they did to
Is
my
it-
boy.
Is it an Eclipse?
I mean, Mitsubishi. I mean,
By
it's-
definition, it is,
Yeah,
right?
it's an Outlander, I think.
okay. Oh, so you're saying, like, is the C8 Corvette still a Corvette because it's mid-engine and all that jazz?
Is the C5 still a Corvette because it's not transverse leaf anymore in the back?
The Corvette question, I think is the most interesting one,
Yeah, 'cause
because
you
it
asked
is
it.
so different now. and I don't know. I've not really driven any of them, so I couldn't tell you where I land on that. But when you think about a car that you're nostalgically attached to, it doesn't matter that it's older and shittier. It's just you have a connection with that car for some reason.
Yeah.
Like, I still love my Bug-Eye WRX.
I've ridden in a C7 Z06, and it was really fast
Yeah.
as a spaceship,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Well, spaceship.
it's got
It's a
fucking
spaceship.
air-conditioned seats.
Yeah.
This isn't a sports car.
That's
Right.
crazy.
This is a cruise liner. Like,
Right.
That's how I felt about the C606 I ran around Pikes Peak, because it was a spaceship. That thing was humongous.
Yeah.
Heads-up display and all the crazy crap in it.
Yep.
But that had, like, the big, had chutzpah.
Yeah.
And it was,
Yeah, sure.
and it handled well, and it was...
I had a buddy in high school whose dad had a C6. Yeah, it was really, it's an automatic too. It was really fast.
Sure.
You got that.
But it was gigantic. And it rode like a boat.
Yeah, it's a barge, right?
This barge is a powerful barge. If there
See,
were synthetic fuels, would there still be sports cars?
Ooh.
It's not what's hanging up sports cars.
No, that's true. But I think
it's the connection, right?
yeah.
It's NTSB rollover protection standards in the mid-90s that made your pillars this wide instead of this wide.
Mm.
And now your car looks like junk. They're all just
They all look
A, B, and C pillars cruising down the road instead of
Right.
beautiful flowing lines and this
Well,
and that.
and
whatever.
from an aerodynamic standpoint, it's really homologized.
And, windshield brake angles.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
So we need to get people to realize that maybe motorsports is relevant because it's exciting, but it's not Formula Motorsports.
And it
it's
makes the
cars
cars
that
different.
look like cars, like normal cars.
Touring car racing?
Something quite like if it was like a stock car type racing. Has that been a thing? That's not
that
on
would
a
never
universal
take. That's
chassis?
ridiculous. There's no way people would ever get excited about just a stock looking car out on a racetrack. That would never take off.
It must be the
that's just
race
dumb.
gas feed
That has
got me.
That has nothing to do with it.
We haven't pissed off NASCAR yet, have we?
I think we just did.
Pissing off NASCAR?
I just put it right
Ironically,
there.
of all of the groups
Cool
that we
two
could
frame
piss off,
cars.
the one that I'm least worried about is NASCAR.
Oh.
'Cause they're on the way down too. They're on the way down too. People
Well,
they
once you start
figured
coming up
out.
with gimmicks to try and make your race more exciting.
Yeah,
they're gonna
boost
throw a pie at the
viewership,
windshield.
right? Yeah.
You know what? What if instead of only making lefts, you threw in a right?
Oh.
No. You
I
cannot.
tried that, and it's not where it's at. And NASCAR is this thing. It's like drag racing. Like, it's not for me. I appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah, it's got its.
Right.
It's
That's
got a place.
fine, right? But again, it's not stock car racing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not fuel issues that have made that way. It's car manufacturers that have forced that hand a bit, right? Like it's.
Well,
and I don't know the politics behind why NASCAR is now a tube chassis spaceship. I don't think it's the finite nature of fossil fuels that has made car racing bad, or the lack of sports cars since 2007 happen.
That went places I did not expect it to go.
Yeah, I guess.
So to everyone listening at home, thank you. Sorry, but thank you more than anything for listening.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think in the comments. What do you think of synthetic fuel, and what do you think of how important relevance is to racing? Does racing have to be relevant for it to be relevant? Does racing have to be relevant?
Racing's not relevant.
Can it just be fun and personal?
But thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. Until next time, as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.